Good morning. If you got a Bible, would you open it to Luke chapter 2? And now, as we're getting started today, we're going to do things a little different. We are going to have a pop quiz today. And this is there's only 5 questions, so if you intend to pass, you've got to do pretty good. Now, I will say this, there are no prizes for passing or no real penalties for failing, but this is a thing, so we're going to get at it. And here are the questions. I want to know, how well do you know the Christmas story? So here's question number 1. What kind of animal did Mary ride to Bethlehem? Someone said cow. I'm betting that's not. Donkey. We got cow, we've got donkey, anything else? Nothing. I've got that as well. Well, if you read the text, there's no mention of any animal anywhere. Actually, that shows up about 150 years later. There was a book called the Proto-Gospel of James that said that. But that's a legend that's put onto the story. She may or may not have, but we don't have really any idea. So, see how you're starting? Second question. How many magi were at the Nativity? Well, since I preached on this last week, I'm hoping that, right, one, there were no magi at the Nativity. They show up a couple years later, and the only thing that we know there is it's plural, so it could be 2, it could be 200. No idea there as for how many. Third, this one's a little harder. What year was Jesus born? Oh my gosh, so the very first person just nailed that, and since I baptized her, that just gives me a sense of pride. Okay, so the answer, here's the deal. We really don't know. We know the BC, AD, we figured out a couple hundred years ago that was a little off, that was off. And what we do know is that Herod the Great, who is definitely alive at the beginning of the Christmas story, died in 4 BC. So the best guess is somewhere between the beginning of 4 BC or as early as 6 BC. So right in that time there's when we are pretty sure is when Jesus of Nazareth was born. All right. Question number 4. Why did the innkeeper turn Joseph and Mary away? Somebody's got to answer. Okay, so I heard fulfilled prophecy. There we go. So look, the former chairman of the elders' wife just pops in with the answer. There is no innkeeper in the story. So yeah, we're going to get into that here in just a bit. Now here may be the hardest one, question 5. And don't worry if there's young parents in here. I'm not going to mess this all up. But what's the deal with St. Nicholas? Okay, so before we answer there, Nicholas lived. I'll give you a little bit of the background here. He was actually a person. His name was Nicholas of Myra, lived in what's now Turkey, lived from 270 to 343. The legend was that there was a poor family in town that had 3 daughters, and they couldn't afford the dowry for the daughters. And one evening, he dropped in 3 bags of money into the window that provided the dowries and a future for those 3 girls. But there is another story that is often told about Nicholas. Anybody got any idea what that is? Somebody yelled, punched heretics. Okay, well, here's the deal. At the very first church council, it's called the Council of Nicaea, Nicholas is said to have walked up to a man named Arius who denied the eternal divinity of Jesus and punched him in the nose. And so now we have my all-time favorite Christmas meme is, it's time to give out presents and punch heretics, and I'm all out of presents. So, now, here's the deal. Whether or not that happened or not is actually pretty sketchy. as to whether or not that's real. But the reason for this little exercise is to demonstrate how much kind of lore and legend blends into the way that we see the Christmas story. And so today, we're going to look at it. Here's one of my favorite Christmas paintings. Lorenzo Lotto, 1523, painted this. And you see the way the culture blends in. One, the age of Joseph, no one has any idea on that, but since he's out of the story fairly early, they think maybe he was an older man. There's really no reason to think that's true. They're wearing colors that no one in first century Jerusalem was going to be able to afford. Baby Jesus is very white for a Middle Eastern child, and the little naked baby angels up there, the architecture. You just see the way that even in our art, we put a lot onto the Christmas story, stuff that probably didn't belong there. There is something incredibly right about that picture, but we will get back to that in just a bit. So let's step into the text. Luke chapter 2. In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that the whole empire should be registered. This first registration took place while Quirinius was governing Syria. So everyone went to be registered, each to his own town. Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and family line of David, to be registered along with Mary, who was engaged to him and was pregnant. And while they were there, the time came for her to give birth. Then she gave birth to her firstborn son. She wrapped him tightly in cloth and laid him in a manger because there was no guest room available for them. For years, as I studied the Christmas story, honestly, I had a lot of questions about it. I've always trusted, and I thank my parents for this. I've always trusted that God's word was true. That made sense to me. But the way that the sum total, the parts came together, and sort of the stuff that was put on top of it, that didn't always I had questions. In Christmas, I had a lot of questions. Why would they travel to the town of his birth if that's all that it was? I mean, wasn't there a way that where he was, he could write, hey, I'm Joseph, but from Bethlehem? If Joseph was from Bethlehem, why didn't they know anybody when they got there? Why are they always alone in the pictures? In a culture of radical hospitality, there is a whole thing there. It is amazing as far as the way that hospitality works. Why would no one open their home to a pregnant woman? That didn't make sense to me. And who in the world invited a kid with a snare drum into a delivery room? Pa-rum-pa-pum-pum. That just doesn't make sense. The questions are legitimate, and I had a feeling that the text was right, but the way that it had been assembled for me was problematic. So this morning, I'd like to draw on the text because that's what we know to be true. And then we're going to use a little bit of history and archaeology to kind of build up around that. And there's a purpose to doing this. The better that we see Christmas, the more incredible the story becomes. Because the better that we see Jesus, that works out into every aspect of life. We see things different. We see the world differently. So let's get into this. We know even outside of Scripture that Herod was building a Roman-style town in Nazareth. If you think the Jewish towns, really narrow roads and the buildings are very close together, but Rome, they did things very different, big wide roads, and it was supposed to be just this picture of luxury. And the town is called Sepphoris. It's just outside of Nazareth. And so the government hired all of the local tradesmen. The Greek word here is tekton. These are folks that work with stone and with wood and with tile. They're both builders and artisans. In the following centuries, particularly Europeans started to translate. Well, who builds our homes? carpenters. But these tradesmen did a lot more than woodwork. And here's a couple of pictures of this place. You see, you can dig it up there now. This is actually from the first century. See the wide roads, and you can tell what's left. And go to the next picture. And this is inside of a home, mosaic floors that they had to build. So we know why a tradesman from Bethlehem would be in Nazareth, living there at the time. Here's the thing, that this is one of my favorite places in Israel, because it's very, very likely that Joseph worked there. We know that they hired all of the local tradesmen to go there and work, so this is where he would have worked. And if he worked, it's likely that he had a young apprentice with him at some point that he taught as he went. And as they go on, he showed, hey, let's make sure that the walls are square. And make sure that you get down to a good foundation, because a foundation has to be on stone. If it's on sand, it's just not going to hold up. And you see today, you can literally touch this area where Joseph worked, and likely where Jesus worked as well. But that's down the road. Here Joseph is working there, and that's when the census happened, because Caesar Augustus was looking for tax dollars. Now, just so we get this clear, and this does need to be stated, Israel was not a part of the Roman Empire then. And I've heard this for some reason debated a bunch recently. They don't become part of the Roman Empire for another decade and a half. But what they are is they're subjects. They pay tribute to Rome to stay safe. That's what keeps the Parthians away. You pay them money, he taxes you, and they make sure that you don't get beat up by the neighboring countries. But they're not Roman citizens at this point. Joseph was in Nazareth, and he had to travel to Bethlehem. And since most homes were passed from one generation to the next, it's likely he owned a home in Bethlehem. Or you would build onto your father's home. So if, when you grew up and you got to be married, you'd build a room on your dad's home. And I'll tell you where this shows up later. Jesus will say something like, in my Father's house, there are many rooms. Weren't so would I've told you that I'm going to prepare a place for you. That's the way that you did there. So Joseph is likely a homeowner in Bethlehem. So he travels to Bethlehem with Mary, who it says engaged, but the word is betrothed. And that's not a word we use all that much anymore, but it means there's a very legal binding. The way that they did that then is the ceremony happened at the engagement. So there would be this ceremony that happened, and then down the road, the official wedding would be. But she's with him, and she is very pregnant. And I think that this is where this account gets kind of marred by legend more than what we actually know. Here's a diagram of a first century Jewish home. This is what they looked like. You had everything happened in kind of day-to-day activities in the first level, and then at night, everyone would go upstairs. The funny little Greek word, kataluma. It can be translated upper room. Remember, Jesus said, go prepare to find an upper room. Or it can be translated guest room or inn. Not motel, but the upper room of a home. And everyone in the family would sleep in that same room up there. Here's a kind of a picture of what that would look like. And do you see those two dips there? Those are mangers, because at night, for an average poor family, a couple of sheep were something that needed to be taken care of. So you would bring them into the home at night. That's the way that they lived. So people slept upstairs, sheep came inside with them at night. As to why there was no room for them in the upper room, in the guest room. Now, we can only speculate at that. Maybe too many family members. Perhaps downstairs would offer more privacy. Then again, this is speculation, but this is a child of controversy. In a time and family when everything, they call it a shame honor society. Everything, you only do things that honor the family, shame would be brought upon the family. Oh, and she's very pregnant. That would have been a big, big deal. It turns out Jesus is controversial even from day one. And can you blame him? If you put yourself into that family, say you're Joe's mom, and Joe comes to his mom and says, hey, Mary's pregnant, but don't worry, it's not my child. As a matter of fact, I had a dream from an angel that she's pregnant. She's never been with a man. If you're Joe's mom, do you believe that for a second? Make no mistake about it, Jesus from day one is controversial. They wouldn't have had a reason to believe that. Not till later when, Elizabeth, she knows, but this is a controversy. Now, while they're there for the census, it's time for her to give birth. Now, here's my only other note on that I do think that needs to be mentioned. It would be very unlikely that Joseph would have been at the birth. Very, very unlikely. They had rules. They called it the Old Testament laws. They had laws against the guys being there for that. And if you ask someone in the medical profession, they will tell you if there is a way out, there is a way in for bacteria, germs, or whatever. And in a woman's condition during and post-delivery, that would become like a superhighway. And so you find here that God protects the gals by saying, hey, the fellas, the guys who are out working with the animals, the guys that are out doing the construction, you don't need to be here for this. What he's doing is protecting women in that. And the funny thing about when you go back and you read all those rules, he never once says why. He just says, hey, I want you to trust me. Keep the guys out. Keep them away. We're going to keep her safe. So it's very unlikely that Joe was even there, more likely some of the women in the family. See, Luke tells us later that night when the shepherds show up, then you have Mary, Joseph, and the baby, but there is nary a word spoken about during the delivery. She gives birth to Jesus while they're there in Bethlehem, and they laid him in a manger, a food trough. Now, the pictures all I happen is what this is an actual photograph of what a manger looked like in first century Jerusalem. They're stone. They're just carved out of stone. It's funny, if you look out one of the meanings of the Greek word there, one of the meanings is tooth socket. And you can look at that and go, well, it looks kind of like a tooth socket. And there would be one of those inside the lower level of a simple family home. C.S. Lewis said that there was something bigger than the whole world laid in that manger. It's funny to me, and if you go back to study the Old Testament, before that town's called Bethlehem, it's called Ephrathah. That's the name of it. It means ash heap. And they changed it to Bethlehem over the years, which just means house of bread. The ash heap, out of the ash heap comes the bread of life. This Jesus. And they laid the bread of life in a food trough. Would you put up that picture again? Remember I said there's something incredibly right about this picture. Art, particularly if you look at old art, is designed to tell a story. Did you notice something in the upper left-hand corner? Where's Jesus on a cross? So what's the artist telling us here? I know y'all didn't think you were going to school today. I'm sorry for that. But I think this makes sense to me. He's telling us that this child came to die. This child came for a purpose. When Mary took baby Jesus and wrapped him in strips of cloth and laid him in that stone manger, you realize that wouldn't be the only time that she would see him like that. Almost 4 decades later, she'd see him wrapped in strips of cloth and laid on a stone slab again. Because he's a child of purpose. He came for a particular reason. So I've taught a bit. Let me preach for just a few minutes. Let's talk about the ordinary reality of the Nativity. This text starts with Caesar on a throne, right? Caesar's deciding that the whole world needs, it's going to count because I want tax dollars. He is the picture of power and authority. And yet we see God show up in an ordinary manger. And that's an entire sermon on itself. You know, when I was a young preacher, I couldn't stand the church calendar. And if you've been around like older denominations, you'll see they have a church calendar that you know, it'll go Advent and then Christmas time and then Epiphany and then Lent. And I couldn't stand any of that because I didn't want anybody telling me what I had to preach on. But the older I get, the more I've become to appreciate those ancient rhythms. Because Advent is a time, it's a yearly reset where we take our eyes off of earthly thrones and we reorient to a manger. And we realize that real power is not held on a throne. Real power is God showing up in an ordinary home. Because the reality is this scene is so very, very ordinary. Poor folks, simple home, dealing with taxes, family drama. They're just ordinary circumstances. And this isn't how anyone anywhere would expect God to say, that's how I'm coming. I'm showing up in that. You expect, the second advent, you know, when he comes in glory, but the first time he says, here's how I'm showing up. The extraordinary became ordinary. The one who existed eternally in the presence of the Father now sleeps in Mary's arms. The Ancient of Days, as Daniel called him, became an infant on that day. The heights of glory to the depths of shame. From the wonders of heaven to the wickedness of earth. From exaltation to humiliation. From, think of it, just the halls of heaven itself to a peasant house in Bethlehem. Because that day in Bethlehem, glory and humiliation were joined together and laid in a manger. The one who was wrapped in light is now wrapped in strips of cloth, and there's no room for him. And it happens so incredibly ordinary. You see why the author of Hebrews, how would he say it? Because we don't have a high priest who's unable to sympathize with our weakness. He's dealt with everything that you and I could possibly face. He didn't come in luxury. He came in a peasant home. He didn't come in a perfect family. He showed up in the middle of drama. And the reality is not any of us can work our way up to him. So he came down to our level. So very ordinary. But let's talk about the extraordinary purpose of an ordinary nativity. Because Christmas has a purpose. The infinite became finite for the likes of you and me. Christmas actually happened for us. For us. I remember Tim Keller arguing powerfully. He says something I think I've tried to get his words as much as I could remember. So if Jesus Christ is a legend, if Christmas is a legend, then Jesus is just an example. If he's an example, he can show you how to care for the poor, a very good thing. He can show you how to tell the truth. That is a good thing. He can tell you how to try to save yourself, but the reality is you won't do it. But if Christmas is real, if reality became fact, and if he actually died on a cross for our sins and rose from the dead and broke the bands of death, then in that case, guess what? Then you and I can be saved by grace. That's the extraordinary purpose of this ordinary nativity. See, Christmas isn't how do so many stories start? Once upon a time. Christmas isn't a once upon a time. Christmas is veiled in flesh the Godhead see. Right? We grew up singing this, Hail the incarnate deity, pleased as men with men to dwell. Jesus our Emmanuel, God with us. Behold him at Christmas. And we look at this incredibly ordinary scene, and we see something so spectacular that words just can't do it justice. Pray with me. Father, thank you. It seems like such a paltry response. But help us to see your Son better in a way that causes us to want to worship him deeper and follow him closer. Change us this Christmas. Amen.